Welcome to the Deep Dive Books channel, where we hope you find something valuable every day.
Let's continue discussing Malcolm Gladwell's Revenge of the Tipping Point. This is the third part of our interpretation. In the previous two parts, we talked about a phenomenon called small area variation, which refers to how a trend often occurs in very specific locations. The reason is that such a location happens to have an overstory, or a singular cultural pattern, that aligns perfectly with that trend. In this segment, we'll explore another mechanism that drives trends: the proportion of people. For example, imagine you have a relatively large group with its own established culture. Now, you want to introduce some outsiders to transform that culture. How many people would you need to bring in? Too few won't work. They'll just be seen as a fringe minority with no real impact. Too many, and the original culture will be completely overrun. So, is there a specific number, a critical threshold, beyond which cultural transformation becomes inevitable? The broad applicability of this principle might surprise you. Understanding this mechanism can help you manipulate social change, or ensure that it doesn't happen. This is the foundation of social engineering. It's such a simple, universal, yet subtle principle that it's often used behind the scenes. Once you grasp this idea, you'll gain deeper insights into many social phenomena. I believe anyone interested in societal issues should learn this concept. Gladwell has a knack for storytelling, especially using montage techniques. He often leaves one story midway to introduce another, building suspense that keeps readers turning the pages. I greatly admire this approach, and recommend reading his original work to appreciate its charm. However, since our space is limited, I'll skip the suspense and get straight to the conclusion. The critical threshold is 1/3. When a minority group reaches a proportion of 25% to 33%, it begins to exert significant influence on the group's culture, potentially sparking major changes. For instance, consider a medium-sized company with a 9-member board of directors. In the past, when women were underappreciated, these boards were typically composed entirely of men. Now, let's say the company realizes that women are better listeners, can address issues men might overlook, and are great at fostering cohesion. They decide to add female members to the board. How many women should they add? One isn't enough. She'll be seen as a token figure, with no real influence on decisions, and she'll likely feel isolated. 2 women can provide mutual support and a sense of safety, but their impact on the board's overall dynamics will remain minimal. However, if there are 3 women, something magical happens. They form a significant block capable of influencing decisions and transforming the company's mindset. As the Chinese saying goes, 3 women make a play. Gladwell calls this the magic third rule. Why doesn't it work below 1/3? This ties into a deeper insight. Allow me to segue briefly. In the United States, Black students generally perform worse academically, compared to white or Asian students. If there's one Black child in a class, you might notice that they seem to lag behind their peers in cognitive ability from kindergarten, with the gap widening over time. This often leads to assumptions about whether Black students are inherently less intelligent. Sociologist Rosabeth Kanter offered a brilliant perspective on this. Kanter argued that it might not be the Black students' innate ability, but the stereotypes imposed on them, that hold them back. If people believe Black students are less capable, they'll unconsciously treat them as such, subtly undermining their performance. This is the Pygmalion effect, where expectations shape outcomes. If a teacher expects little of you, you'll sense it and likely underperform. But here's the key insight. Kanter pointed out that these stereotypes arise because the Black student is in the extreme minority. If there's only one Black student in a class, the teacher doesn't see them as an individual, but as the Black student, applying stereotypes accordingly. Think about it. If there's only one woman in a team, she's seen as the woman, not as an individual. If you're the only Chinese student in a foreign class, you might feel a strong sense of representing all Chinese people. People might expect you to bring dumplings to a party, or even perform martial arts. This is the cognitive treatment of minorities. However, if the minority group exceeds a critical threshold, everything changes. People begin to see them as individuals, granting them equal treatment. studies have confirmed this. In classrooms where Black students make up more than 25%, their academic performance no longer lags behind their white peers. Interestingly, white students in such classes don't see their performance drop either. For example, one study found that, in American juries, men often take on active, task-oriented roles, while women assume passive, emotional roles. Classic stereotype. Rosabeth Kanter challenged this notion, arguing that the juries studied typically had very few women. Their personalities were suppressed, leaving them to conform to the archetype of traditional femininity. When the minority group doesn't reach a critical mass, they become symbolized. For minorities to express their authentic selves, not just their ethnicity or gender, but their individual identity, is incredibly difficult. Indra Nooyi, a woman of Indian origin, who immigrated to the United States at a young age, worked her way up to become the CEO of PepsiCo in 2006. She was the first Indian woman to lead a Fortune 500 company and even had a Chinese name, Luingda. As you might expect, when Nooyi was appointed CEO, the media coverage in the United States framed the story as, "An Indian woman becomes CEO of PepsiCo." The Wall Street Journal went so far as to describe her wearing a traditional Indian sari and walking barefoot. Nooyi responded, "I haven't worn a sari in 25 years, okay? I go to work every day looking like a typical American professional, and I do not walk around barefoot." This may seem discriminatory, but it's really just the power of stereotypes. When you are a minority, you are inevitably reduced to a symbol. The book also mentions a Black woman, who excelled academically and studied engineering, a field with very few women. Later, she became an executive at a Fortune 500 company. During her school years, her male classmates would say, "You're such a genius." In hindsight, she reflected, "Isn't that also a form of discrimination?" By labeling me a genius, they avoided confronting their own biases against Black people and women. But don't worry. Once the numbers surpass the critical threshold, the situation changes. As of 2022, there were 60 Indian-origin CEOs in Fortune 500 companies, including the CEOs of Microsoft, Google, and IBM. In Silicon Valley, the number of Indian executives is countless. The threshold has been crossed. It's reached the point where, when Americans talk about Indian executives, the first thing that comes to mind is no longer the Indian label. For example, Microsoft CEO, Satya Nadella, has performed exceptionally well in recent years. People love discussing his business insights and political savvy, viewing him as an individual rather than a symbol. If you say, "Oh, that Indian guy," you're officially out of touch. In 2023, when Starbucks appointed an Indian-origin CEO, the Wall Street Journal ran an in-depth interview. Throughout the article, there was not a single mention of his Indian heritage. The day Xing Qinwen is simply Xing Qinwen, and not the tennis player from China, is the day Chinese tennis will have truly arrived. The magic third rule also applies dynamically. Take the U.S. in the 1950s. During the Civil Rights Movement, many Black Southerners, tired of discrimination, moved to freer cities like New York and Chicago. This created a social dilemma. At the time, Americans valued their neighborhoods deeply, with close-knit communities in single-family homes. While a single Black family moving in wasn't seen as a major issue, people feared that more would follow, eventually altering the community's culture and causing property values to plummet. To address this, community organizers asked white residents how many Black families they could accept in their neighborhoods. Many said 5% was fine. Others agreed to 10%. The number gradually rose to 25%, but at 30%, they drew the line. This experience led to a paradoxical policy. To prevent racial segregation, authorities had to enforce strict limits on Black residents' proportions within communities. Some places actually operate this way. Palo Alto, likely the most expensive city in Silicon Valley, sits right next to Stanford University. Its residents are mostly tech elites, and it boasts some of the best high schools in the region. Within Palo Alto lies a tiny neighborhood called Lawrence Lane, which perfectly illustrates the concept of small area variation. This neighborhood has only a dozen or so homes, all single-family houses. Compared to the surrounding areas, the homes here have retained their 1950s appearance, with little redevelopment. Lawrence Lane is less than 3 miles from Stamford, a prime location. So why hasn't anyone developed it? It's due to a stipulation set in the 1950s. To prevent the proportion of black residents from exceeding a critical threshold, the neighborhood established strict rules. 1/3 of the properties must be owned by black residents, 1/3 by white residents, and 1/3 by Asian residents. From then on, a black-owned house could only be sold to another black buyer, a white-owned house to a white buyer, and an Asian-owned house to an Asian buyer. On one occasion, a white family urgently wanted to sell their home, and a black buyer offered a significant sum of money. The community refused the sale, ultimately opting to have the neighborhood purchase the property and leave it vacant. This kind of property is impossible for developers to touch. Lawrence Lane has stalled in development, but it's true that racial segregation hasn't occurred in this area. So, is this type of social engineering moral or immoral? It's a thought-provoking question. To avoid the color shift of an entire community, they had to cap the number of black residents. By that logic, to ensure a team meets its critical threshold for female representation, should fewer men be hired? Could you tell an applicant, sorry, we can't hire you because we must maintain 1/3 female representation? Wouldn't that be discrimination against men? Take another example. Imagine you're an administrator for an elementary school district with a small number of black students scattered across multiple schools. Could you argue that, to meet the critical threshold, all black students should be concentrated into one school? Or even one class? That sounds suspiciously like segregation. The so-called 1/3 rule is an intuitively logical concept, but its practical implementation often feels awkward. Let's continue this discussion in the next lecture. That's it for today's content. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.
If you feel there is value in this, please like, subscribe to this channel, and leave your thoughts or suggestions in the comments section. Let's grow together and read more good books.